Have you ever felt, in the silence of an ordinary night, that something greater is trying to speak to you, but the words come as a whisper no one wants to hear? There is a cry the world does not hear, and it comes in silence. This phrase is not just a poetic image, it is the starting point of something urgent and little known. Stay with me until the end, because what you will discover now may surprise you and perhaps change the way you see the signs of the times. Today we will delve into the 7 unrevealed messages of Medjugorje, warnings from the Virgin that still pulse in the hearts of few, and that continue to resonate as warnings for those willing to listen. Medjugorje is not just a place on the map for many, it is an epicenter of prophecies, intimate encounters, and words calling for conversion, prayer, and vigilance. The stories of the visionaries, the conversations with the Virgin, the signs in the heavens, and personal transformations compose a mosaic that blends mystery, faith, and a sense of spiritual urgency. I'm not here to argue or affirm what the Church has already declared. I'm here to present stories, connections, and possible practical applications of these messages to everyday life. Have you ever experienced that moment when an inner sensation calls you to change something urgent? Perhaps that's what these messages are trying to provoke: true change, before the external signs intensify. Throughout this introduction, I want you to keep 2 things in mind. First, that these warnings are presented by those who claim to have heard them directly. Second, that they call for a concrete response, not just intellectual curiosity. Keywords like Medjugorje, Unrevealed Messages, the Virgin Mary, prophecies, and tribulation are not used here as sensationalist titles, but as gateways to a serious dialogue about faith and preparation. Some see in the prophecies only fear, others see an invitation to active hope, and it is precisely in this tension between warning and promise that the interest of so many lies. The call to inner conversion that precedes any great change, the urgency of prayer and fasting as real tools of protection, and the appeal to family as refuge and mission. As you follow me, imagine for a moment the scene: crowds looking to the sky, hearts beating faster, families gathered in prayer, questions that once seemed small taking on a lifelike dimension, signs appearing in the clouds, movements of hearts that alter destinies, testimonies of people who claim to have been touched and transformed. All of these make up the landscape of the messages we will explore, and these are not just distant stories. Many of these warnings touch on practical situations: how to discern false signs, how to restore relationships, how to be a light in the midst of confusion. If at any point you feel skeptical, that's your right. Discernment is one of the keys the messages themselves require. At the same time, if any part of this resonates with you, write in the comments below about your feelings. Sharing an experience can be the beginning of a community of serious and respectful seeking. Now, without giving everything away at once, get ready. In the next sections, we'll calmly and deeply unravel each of the 7 unrevealed messages. We'll understand what each warning means, how it relates to the greater prophecies, and most importantly, what you can apply in your life right now to respond to this silent cry. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what touched you most, or any experience related to signs, prayer, or conversion. Reading your stories makes all the difference and helps others feel less alone in this quest. Your participation here isn't just a number. When you comment, share a testimony, or ask a question, you transform this channel into a living space of discovery and support. That's how we can reach more hearts and bring these messages to those who truly need to hear them. If this video resonates with you, hit the like button. It's a simple gesture that shows this content is valuable and deserves continued production. And if you want to follow each new reflection, each analysis on prophecies and signs, subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you ensure you won't miss future episodes and also help keep this project alive. All of this comments, likes, and subscriptions supports a work that strives to be serious, welcoming, and transformative. Now, joining us in this together, let's move forward and begin to unravel the first of the 7 unrevealed messages, to understand its weight and urgency. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and before we dive into the messages, one by one, I want to paint a clear picture of what you'll experience throughout this journey. I know lists, just a natural sequence of discoveries that will help you understand why these warnings have such impact today. First, let's go back to the source. Understanding Medjugorje isn't just about pointing out a place on a map or repeating names. It's about delving behind the scenes of encounters that, according to reports, changed mindsets, transformed lives, and left a trail of revelations that defy easy explanation. I'll tell you how it all began, who were the voices they heard, and how these words reached the ears of ordinary people. It's in this encounter between the everyday and the supernatural that lies the hidden truth that many avoid facing. Next, we'll explore each of the 7 unrevealed messages with the attention of someone reading an ancient map, not just describing what was said, but unraveling the practical meaning of each warning. You'll discover how a message that seems spiritual can impact concrete decisions, from how we care for our family to profound choices about our routine of prayer, fasting, and vigilance. there will be explanations that connect signs in the heavens with signs in daily life, because prophetic symbolism often manifests first in an interchange before being reflected in the outer world. The idea here is not to create unnecessary fear, but to offer tools for discernment and attitude, a mindset of preparedness that isn't limited to fear, but opens to transformation. As we explore these messages, I'll show the real impact they had on ordinary people, accounts of conversion, small decisions that led to major turnarounds, and testimonies that serve as social proof that something truly resonated. Don't expect sensationalism. Instead, expect human, nuanced accounts that show how faith, relationship, recovery, and the rebuilding of hope can emerge from warnings that, at first glance, seem harsh. I'll also address the topic of discernment, because in times of spiritual confusion, the ability to differentiate between authentic revelation and a false sign is essential. And this ability depends more on fruitfulness and coherence than on fleeting emotions. Along the way, we'll touch on practical issues, how to apply these warnings to your daily life without losing your peace, how the discipline of prayer and fasting can become a routine of strength and clarity, how small changes in attitude can alter the course of an entire family. I'll offer reflections on decisions that seem trivial but have a cumulative effect on your spiritual and emotional journey, ideas on how transformation happens step by step, how a renewed mindset affects daily choices, and how this resonates in the most intimate circles of your life. These practical applications are the point where theory meets everyday life. It's there that the messages cease to be theories and become tools for living with greater truth and purpose. We'll also delve into the behind-the-scenes reactions, why some communities welcomed these messages and others distrusted them, what ethical, theological, and social dilemmas arise when the topic involves prophecy and authority, and how the search for signs can both strengthen faith and create traps if there's no balance. In this space, I'll invite you to think critically, but with an open heart, because discernment isn't cold skepticism. It's an exercise in responsibility toward what claims to be supernatural. We'll do this without losing our tenderness when we talk about families, wounded hearts, and promises of light amidst darkness. There's no room for coldness. At the same time, I want you to grasp the collective dimension of this story. It's not an individual truth just for those who were in Medjugorje, but a set of messages that touched communities, inspired prayer practices, and mobilized people to action. We'll see how small communities organized themselves, how testimonies of conversion emerged, and how, often, the impact was more internal than in the headlines. The narrative we'll construct is, therefore, at once intimate and public. Intimate because it touches the heart of each reader. Public because its consequences spread when personal decisions become examples. As I guide you, there will be moments of surprise revelations that seem to defy common logic and moments of calm, where the depth of the call to conversion reveals itself as a loving invitation rather than a threatening warning. The proposal is that you leave here with a new sensitivity, capable of recognizing signs, making decisions that generate real transformation, and participating, if you wish, in a community of search. We won't just consume stories. We'll consider how these stories can influence your mindset, your priorities, and even the conversations around the dinner table. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and, without rushing, begin to unveil the first of the 7 unrevealed messages as a distant abstraction, but as a direct invitation to reflection and change. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Medjugorje is much more than the name of a town. It is a meeting point between the visible and the invisible that began to pulsate in the hearts of many in 1981, when a small group of young people began reporting apparitions of the Virgin Mary. I won't make anything up. I'll explain what was reported and what it might mean for you. The visionaries, ordinary people with simple life stories and humble routines, claimed to have received messages calling for conversion, prayer, fasting, and vigilance. These words, recorded by those who heard them, created a narrative that blends intimate experiences with global repercussions, and it is this combination that brought Medjugorje out of the hills and into the attention of believers, theologians, and curious onlookers around the world. What moves so many people to pay attention are the stories, encounters that, according to those who were there, transformed mindsets and priorities. These aren't just spectacular phenomena, but subtle shifts, renewed way of approaching decisions, relationships, and one's own inner journey. Some say the messages brought practical advice for family life, spiritual strategies for coping with crises, and warnings about signs that, if observed carefully, anticipate more difficult times. All of this has a real impact on the community. People who return home with a new rhythm of prayer, families who reorder priorities, individuals who seek real transformation, step by step. On the other hand, the story of Medjugorje is fraught with controversy. Experts, religious leaders, and even ecclesiastical bodies are divided between accepting it, analyzing it with reservations, or urging caution. Part of the discussion stems from the complexity of verifying subjective experiences. Another part arises from the institutional need to discern with theological and pastoral criteria. This doesn't negate the experiences of those who were transformed, but it places these apparitions in a context where discernment is essential. In other words, it's possible to recognize both the human dimension of these stories and the need to evaluate their fruitfulness and coherence. Amidst this, words like hidden truth and revelations frequently appear, sometimes used with hope, others with suspicion, and the tension between these sentiments is precisely what fuels global interest. The attention Medjugorje receives isn't just media attention, it's practical. Pilgrims come seeking healing, meaning, and a connection that touches their lives. In the small chapels and homes, there are stories of silent conversions, decisions that changed careers, relationships that were restored, and spiritual habits that came to define entire days. These behind-the-scenes accounts of faith show that the messages influence behavior, the discipline of daily prayer, the transformation of mindsets when faced with moral choices. Fasting, understood as an instrument of clarity and a willingness to act with mercy. When we speak of impact, we're not just talking about intense emotions in a moment, but about lasting consequences that shape personal and family trajectories. It's also important to consider the historical and geopolitical context. Medjugorje emerged at a time of tension, social change, and spiritual unrest. Thus, part of the fascination stems from the feeling that these messages touch something collective, a concern for the soul of nations, for cultural patterns, and for the direction of decisions societies make. At the same time, there's an intimate appeal. The messages, as reported, seek to touch hearts so that transformation begins within the individual and reverberates throughout their surroundings. It's a proposal that combines urgency and tenderness, warning and hope, something that challenges both the mindset of immediacy and the comfort of easy answers. When considering these visionaries, it's important to remember that we're not talking about public figures seeking fame. These are people who, according to their own accounts, were called to bear a heavy responsibility. This generates empathy, but it also demands critical analysis. Analyzing these stories with intellectual honesty means listening to the accounts, examining the consequences, and observing whether the changes they generate produce fruits of peace, love, and coherence, criteria that help separate what builds from what merely impresses momentarily. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic and begin to unravel the first of the 7 unrevealed messages, understanding not only the wording, but also what they ask for in practice. What decisions disrupt routine? What kind of transformation is required? And how the hidden truth of a calling can manifest itself in concrete actions. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and talk about what we actually call unrevealed messages, because understanding this distinction changes how you perceive the entire Medjugorje narrative. Not every word that circulates about apparitions immediately becomes public or official. There is a divide between what was communicated publicly, what made it into formal records, and what remained as fragments, intimate warnings that circulated in small circles before gaining wider attention. These messages that remained outside the mainstream are not necessarily less true for being less publicized. They often have a more pastoral character, more targeted to specific contexts, or arrive as discreet warnings that pulsed in the hearts of those who heard them. They are revelations with a confidential tone, calling for quiet transformation, internal decisions, and realignments of mindset before any major public exposure. The hidden truth here is not conspiratorial. It is another layer of sensitivity. These are words that reached the ears of few, but that had a profound impact on the journey of those who heard them, creating consequences that spread to behaviors, prayer habits, family priorities, and, sometimes, radical life choices. When we differentiate between public and undisclosed messages, we open up space to analyze the behind-the-scenes aspects of spiritual experience, the encounters that took place away from the cameras, the prayers offered in silence, the stories exchanged between neighbors that became seeds of conversion. While official statements often undergo processes of verification, translation, and institutional consideration, intimate fragments survive through human repetition, personal testimony, and the practical impact they have had on lives. This creates a curious phenomenon. Some messages function more like seeds than headlines. They fall on fertile ground in the heart and, over time, bear fruit in the form of real change. This is where personal discernment becomes crucial, because responding to an intimate warning depends on a mindset open to transformation, courageous decisions, and a willingness to experience revelations in daily life. The impact of these unspoken messages often manifests itself silently and cumulatively. It's not uncommon to find families reporting adjustments to their routines, people deciding to invest more time in prayer or fasting, and communities restructuring welcoming practices after hearing a warning that for some time had only circulated. In small circles, the public narrative tends to highlight spectacular signs and events, but lasting change often comes from discreet daily work, from the discipline that emerges when someone decides their journey requires a different pace. a different priority. Thus, unspoken revelations can be understood as catalysts for transformation. They don't promise instant enlightenment, but rather invite a journey of reparation and coherence that, if sustained, produces a real impact on relationships, faith, and life choices. It's also important to contextualize this dynamic within the human reality of the visionaries and the communities involved. When an ordinary person reports a powerful experience, the message they receive can be adapted to their own life and the lives of those around them. There's not always a desire to turn it into a spectacle. Sometimes the message has a tone of pastoral urgency, a call to repair a family, a request for prayer for a person in pain, a recommendation to fast for a specific period. These instructions, because they are so practical, end up circulating organically, affecting everyday decisions, and shaping a mindset of vigilance and spiritual responsibility. Therefore, looking only at the official versions can give us an incomplete view of what truly became part of the lives of those who were touched. Furthermore, speaking of unrevealed messages forces us to consider the role of collective and individual discernment. In a time when information spreads rapidly, the process of evaluating the results, verifying whether what has been transmitted generates peace, coherence, and love becomes the most solid criterion. Spiritual experience is not a product to be consumed. It is a responsibility that demands maturity, reflection, and, above all, actions that confirm the authenticity of what was said. Therefore, these intimate messages require each person to ask themselves, does this word call me to concrete transformation? Does it lead me to decisions that bear good fruit? If the answer is yes, then the practical effect outweighs the need for fame or external validation. And there's another point. Unrevealed messages often carry symbolic language that requires interpretation, a kind of pastoral code that points to spiritual realities through images and signs. Reading these images requires good references, a willingness to study, and the humility to avoid jumping to conclusions. What might seem, at first glance, like a cataclysmic warning is often an invitation to intimate conversion, a hidden truth that, when applied, transforms mindsets and behaviors gradually but irreversibly. This decoding process is part of the behind-the-scenes process. It involves spiritual leaders, testimonies, and the interweaving of personal stories that ultimately form a broader picture. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and begin to show, with concrete examples and verified stories, how one of these hidden messages began to produce practical changes in entire communities, not as a theory, but as a consequence of small decisions that multiplied over time. Comment: that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. When we talk about unrevealed messages, we're not talking about a sealed package of pretty words, but rather warnings that arrived as fragments, whispers that ran through confessions, personal trajectories, and accounts that often fell outside the mainstream. The difference between a public message, widely disseminated and subject to institutional scrutiny, and these more intimate warnings is simple in form, complex in effect. The former enter the official narrative circuit, the latter echo behind the scenes, influencing individual decisions and transforming mindsets without making major headlines. It is in this gray area that the hidden truth that so intrigues resides, a revelation that circulates in conversations, that alters routines, that shifts priorities, and, therefore, generates a silent and lasting impact. Looking at these fragmented messages, we perceive a practical pattern. It's not just mystical language, it's an invitation to transformation. In many accounts, what arrives as a warning translates into concrete actions: reordering the house, prioritizing prayer, restoring broken relationships, choosing paths that favor peace over convenience. This is the practical dimension of the message, not a distant prophecy, but a call that questions decisions and demands a new mindset. For those who live this calling, the journey is both personal and social. It changes who you are and how you influence those around you. Ultimately, the unrevealed messages function as an emotional and spiritual index, fragments that, when assembled, form a map of warning and promise. And to facilitate your mental navigation, I want to present an overview of these 7 warnings in short sentences that act as an index. The first message is a call to inner conversion. The second emphasizes the urgency of prayer and fasting as a discipline of preparation. The third speaks of visible signs in the heavens and discrete signs in daily life. The fourth emphasizes the family as a field of protection and mission. The fifth points to testimonies of conversion that serve as social proof and encouragement. The sixth warns of false signs and the need for discernment. And the seventh delivers a promise of hope linked to a demand for vigilance and consistency. Each of these sentences is a doorway and invitation to enter specific scenes where the warning finds application, where the symbol is translated into action. These summaries don't exhaust the content. Quite the opposite. They serve as a mental map that will accompany our conversation. As we continue, we'll slowly open each door, understanding the original context of the story, the possible signs that accompany it, and, most importantly, the practical application for those seeking transformation today. This isn't about adhering to a discourse, but about putting into perspective how these small warnings, when heeded, can have a domino effect on a person's life and the community. Imagine a seemingly small decision: resuming family prayer, forgiving a sibling, reducing a routine of excesses, and witness the impact it can have on a personal journey. The hidden truth begins to reveal itself not as an esoteric secret, but as tangible change. It's also important to recognize the behind-the-scenes nature of this story. There's curiosity, hope, fear, and a legitimate search for signs that guide collective choices. Therefore, any honest analysis must balance emotion and criticism, acceptance and responsibility. We're talking about stories that touch our hearts and, at the same time, touch on social realities, political decisions, cultural convictions, community movements. The power of hidden messages lies less in their theatricality and more in their ability to provoke reflection and action. This is their key impact, transforming mindsets and adjusting decisions that reverberate beyond the individual. When you think about it this way, it becomes clear that we're not just consuming stories. We're observing a phenomenon that demands a response, a practice of discernment, a willingness to change, and a sense of mission that begins at home and can spread beyond. These 7 sentences I just gave you are the guiding thread there. Not the conclusion, but a framework for reading. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and, without rushing, begin to unfold the first message, understanding what it asks of you in practice and the real impact it can have on your journey and your relationships. Comment: this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and begin with the one that opens all other doors, the call to inner conversion. Imagine a voice that doesn't shout with paint and flags, but that reaches like a breath in your chest, a call that takes your breath away and demands an intimate decision. When was the last time you truly repented? I'm not talking about empty promises or quick regrets that evaporate over time, but about a change that touches the root of choices, alters mindsets, and transforms seemingly small habits into paths of reconstruction. Inner conversion, according to the accounts surrounding the Unrevealed Messages, is not just a one-off gesture. It is a journey of transformation that requires conscious decisions, emotional discipline, and the courage to confront hidden truths about ourselves. This first message acts as a mirror. It reflects where you're stuck, what patterns dominate your routine, and how your priorities are shaping your destiny. It's not an external demand. It's an invitation to change the internal architecture of your life. Think about your week. How much attention do you dedicate to the family relationships, silence, reflection hand? How much do you lose in distractions that detract from what truly matters? Inner conversion requires a redesign of these choices. It's a transformation that operates at the mental level and gradually alters every day. Decisions: getting up a little earlier for a time of reflection, exchanging trivial conversation for a sincere confession, prioritizing presence over empty productivity. These are small revolutions that, accumulated, have a profound impact on your journey. In the context of Medjugorje, this warning recurs as a constant call. Don't wait for grandiose signs to appear outside of you to change. Change begins within, in the heart. There's a hidden truth in this simplicity. Many revelations lose their power when they don't find fertile ground in real actions. Therefore, the message isn't just meant to move. It's meant to bear fruit. The transformation it calls for is practical. It's not distant mystical, but a series of concrete choices that demonstrate, in everyday life, a new direction. This has tangible effects behind the scenes of life: reconciliations that had been postponed, ethical decisions in work situations, a new way of consuming news and opinions, a discipline to care for one's own soul instead of seeking immediate relief and distractions. When speaking of inner conversion, we also need to address the price and beauty of this process. True change involves renunciations, sometimes gentle, sometimes painful, and, at the same time, offers freedom. Those who decide to change harmful habits experience progressive relief, improved relationships, a clarity that previously seemed impossible, a peace that sustains difficult decisions. And this movement is not just individual. When a person changes the way they love, act, and prioritize, the effect reverberates throughout their family, their circle of friends, and their work. The message here is twofold. The transformation is personal, but its impact is collective. Therefore, the question about sincere repentance is not rhetorical. It is an invitation to evaluate whether your life shows signs of these transformative choices. There is also an aspect of discernment in this conversion. It's not about accepting any idea that presents itself as revelation. It's about verifying its fruits, monitoring whether the change generates greater peace, charity, and coherence. The conversion that matters produces fruits of mercy, respect, and integrity. When a spiritual decision leads to pride, division, or passivity in the face of evil, it loses its authenticity. Therefore, the message insists on linking the inner calling to concrete practices: prayer that generates humility, fasting that purifies intentions, works that confirm faith. These are tools for a transformation that resists time and superficiality. At the same time, it's important to recognize that this change doesn't happen magically. Conversion is a process. It requires time, endurance, patience, and companionship. Many stories speak of long journeys, of cycles of falling and starting, again, of moments when hope seemed distant. Still, the insistence of the messages is clear. Inner metamorphosis is worth the effort. It rebuilds priorities and reorients decisions toward a greater purpose. If you look at your own life honestly, you might identify a starting point, an attitude you can transform today, and that, if maintained, will open space for deeper revelations and changes. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and show, with real, practical examples, how this first message translates into concrete steps that anyone can take right now as an impersonal ritual, but as choices that shape character, mindset, and destiny. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and touch on something that, in the Medjugorje accounts, appears with almost military insistence: the urgency of prayer and fasting. It's not an optional recommendation or an antiquated custom. According to those who claim to have heard it directly, it's a matter of preparation, a discipline that functions as a spiritual defense and a mind clarifier in times of confusion. When the visionaries repeat that it's not optional, it's preparation, they're not just talking about a collective ritual, but a transformative practice that alters mindsets, sharpens discernment, and provides support for difficult decisions. Prayer, in these accounts, isn't just words. It's a posture of the heart that changes how you react to the world and reestablishes priorities. Fasting, in turn, appears as an instrument of cleansing. It's not punishment. It's a tool to remove from the path that dulls spiritual sensitivity and prevents hidden truth from becoming clear, understanding, and coherent action. To think of it as mere tradition is to miss the practical impact these practices can have on a real journey of transformation. There's a psychological and physiological dimension to all this, reducing distractions, silencing internal and external noise, creating space to listen. All of this alters decision. In practical terms, those who adopt prayer routines and periods of fasting report greater clarity, less emotional reactivity, and an increased ability to perceive signals that previously went unnoticed. It's a cumulative effect. Small daily aside an extra minute of silence upon waking, avoiding excessive news before bed, choosing a lighter meal for a day have a direct impact on the quality of reflection, emotional control, and coherent attitudes. In the context of the hidden messages, these disciplines are presented as active preparation, not to promote panic, but to create a posture of calm, vigilance, and personal and community responsibility. The visionary's authority, at this point, is used as a practical call, not an imposition. They describe prayer as a dialogue that transforms vision. It ceases to be an internal monologue and becomes attentive listening. And when I speak of fasting, I'm not referring to extremes or dangerous practices. I'm talking about simple, safe actions that anyone can try to gain clarity. A practical example that many people find accessible is dedicating 5 minutes upon waking to guided silence, deep breaths, a brief examination of conscience, a simple request for guidance for the day. This practice, repeated for weeks, tends to shift mindset. The day begins less reactive, and small decisions gain a firmer foundation of intention. Another suggestion is to set aside 1 day a week to reduce consumption of content, social media, excessive news, and replace it with nourishing reading, prayer, or family time. This type of digital fasting functions as a symbolic fast that creates space for revelations and choices more aligned with deep values. The messages also emphasize that the practice of communal prayer, bringing the family together, even for a few minutes, has a multiplier effect. It's not about religious performance, but about creating networks of care that transform decisions and protect relationships. When a family decides to prioritize a short time of silence together, the impact spreads. Priorities shift, conversations gain depth, and routines begin to have meeting points that sustain the journey of transformation. And behind the scenes of these stories, what emerges most are accounts of small changes that, when persistent, led to character shifts, reconciliations, and a growing sense of purpose. It is this concrete impact that gives credibility to the warnings. They don't remain merely mysterious, but touch on what is tangible and transformative. At the same time, care must be taken not to confuse discipline with rigidity or to turn spiritual practices into an empty checklist. Intention is central. Prayer that generates humility, fasting that purifies motives, decisions that spring from a more serene heart. Discernment and balance are part of the preparation. The message calls not only for fervor, but also for wisdom, when to accelerate, when to pause, when to seek companionship, and when to retreat. This balance prevents the practice from generating exhaustion or spiritual pride, problems that can erode any process of genuine transformation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic And to do so, I'll share practical examples of people who adopted small routines and saw their mindset and decisions palpably change, and also outline simple steps you can try right away, without complications, to make prayer and fasting real tools in your life. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and talk about something that stirs curiosity and, at the same time, a sense of mystery. The signs in the heavens and the signs on earth that, according to accounts from Medjugorje, often accompany the messages. There have been reports that have caused crowds to look to the sky, and this image is powerful because it exposes a collective concern, what truly announces a visible phenomenon, and what is merely human interpretation in search of meaning. When we speak of signs in the heavens, I'm not referring to spectacular, unfounded speculation, but to events that many witnesses described as unusual lights, cloud movements with patterns that seemed intentional, or even a collective sense of something beyond the ordinary. These accounts gained traction not only because of people's natural curiosity, but also because of their psychological impact. Seeing something that challenges routine changes mindsets, prompts decisions, and opens space for reflection on personal and community transformation. At the same time, there are signs on earth, acts of mercy that resonate, encounters that change destinies, signs in human relationships that amount to a practical warning, a restorative forgiveness, a encounter, a change of direction in a family that reveals, deep within, the same symbolic content as a heavenly vision. This correspondence between heaven and earth is part of the hidden truth that many feel emerges from unrevealed messages. The symbol externalizes an inner reality, and the inner reality manifests itself in concrete signs among us. The fascination with visible signs has several layers. First, there's the emotional dimension. Witnessing something unusual draws immediate attention, generates stories that circulate, and often mobilize pilgrimages and collective prayers. Second, there's the narrative effect. A light in the sky becomes a story and becomes part of the fabric of belief, contributing to a collective memory that shapes decisions and priorities. Third, there's the risk, and it's a real risk of transforming any rare event into a prophetic guarantee without analyzing its fruits and context. Curiosity is valuable, but it requires filters, discipline of thought, practices of discernment, and a perspective that seeks real impact on life, not just fleeting emotion. In other words, a true sign, if authentic, should produce fruits of charity, coherence, and transformation, not elevate pride or fuel divisions. This is the practical lens the messages seem to suggest. Observe the signs, yes, but examine what they produce in terms of ethical decision-making, mindset transformation, and habit change. There's also a sociological component worth considering: the way stories spread across social media, local media, and faith communities. A phenomenon observed by some ends up becoming a topic of conversation at many tables. This can amplify the impact: positive when it encourages prayer and conversion, problematic when it generates anxiety or panic. The challenge is to separate sincere experience from mass hysteria. To achieve this, the message calls for balance, not abolishing attention to signs, but integrating it into a practice of discernment. Discerning involves checking witnesses, evaluating consequences, seeking coherence with values that promote life and peace, and talking to trusted people who can help interpret without rushing. This is an invitation to spiritual and intellectual maturity, observing with curiosity, pondering responsibly, deciding with serenity. Furthermore, there is a practical beauty in this correspondence between celestial and earthly signs. It allows people who haven't experienced a phenomenon in the sky to perceive that something is being said through the small revolutions of everyday life. A family that decides to prioritize prayer, a neighbor who decides to help without fanfare, a community that organizes around caring for the most vulnerable of these can be read as a sign on earth that echoes a greater calling. This interpretation transforms the spectator into an agent. Instead of waiting only for external manifestations, the person can observe and, above all, act, promoting real impact wherever they are. The implicit message is clear. Signs are not ends in themselves. They are starting points that require decisions and practices that provoke transformation. Finally, there's an aspect of mystery that can't be overlooked. Not everything is measurable. Not everything fits into clear categories, and some stories remain enigmas that encourage searching. This searching, if done with humility and responsibility, can lead to a mindset of serene vigilance, willingness to learn, to adjust decisions, and to welcome revelations without losing one's feet on the ground. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and begin to look, with attention and care, at the fourth message, the one that places the family at the center as a field of protection and mission. Comment: this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and talk about something that, in the unrevealed messages, emerges with singular force: the family as a battlefield and, at the same time, as a refuge. Think of it this way: in the same home where tensions arise, healing can also blossom. The warnings that came as whispers in Medjugorje always return to this point, because true transformation begins where the most intimate decisions are made, where mindsets are formed, where old patterns are repeated or broken. There is a hidden truth in this. Protecting the family is not just an affectionate gesture. It is a spiritual strategy with a real impact on the choices, habits, and journey of each member. When a home becomes a place of prayer and reconciliation, the consequences reverberate beyond the walls. They shift priorities, shape behaviors, and alter the landscape of decisions that were previously made automatically. Messages that emphasize family do so not with language of blame or repression, but with loving urgency. Reconciliation appears as a key word because many of the wounds that corrode relationships begin small and silent. An unspoken word, an attitude of pride, a silence that builds distance. Reconciliation is not a public performance. It is an intimate decision that requires courage to seek dialogue, humility to ask for forgiveness, and generosity to offer forgiveness. When a family is willing to do this, the impact is twofold. It restores affection and creates an environment where spiritual revelations and guidance can be welcomed with greater clarity, not as emotional entertainment, but as practical guidance. That transforms routines. Prayer at home, in the narratives that accompany these accounts, functions as a safety net. I'm not talking about long theological discourses. I'm talking about simple, repeated gestures that imbue meaning and coherence. A daily moment of silence, a short prayer before meals, a moment of blessing before leaving or at bedtime. These acts, practiced with intention, transform ordinary spaces into places of peace. Imagine the scene: a family gathered for a few minutes, hands held, breathing in sync, a simple phrase of gratitude, and a sincere request for guidance. This ritual creates a framework that guides decisions throughout the day, reduces emotional reactivity, and strengthens the ability to face crises with poise. It is in this routine that the sacredness of bonds becomes concrete, because it doesn't depend on fleeting feelings, but on intentional repetition that changes habits. Giving a practical example is helpful here, not as a magic formula, but as an accessible suggestion. At the end of a meal, instead of everyone going to their phones, how about someone say, "Let's give thanks together and ask for peace for our home." 2 or 3 simple phrases, follow a thank you, a request for protection, and a wish for reconciliation. For anyone in conflict, sometimes just one member proposing this small gesture is enough for the home's mentality to begin to shift. Another practice is establishing a minute of silence at dawn, where each person takes a deep breath, thinks about an intention for the day, and, if desired, whispers a short prayer. These small decisions, incorporated into daily life, have a cumulative effect that appears behind the scenes. Fewer impulsive arguments, more attention to others, and more calmly considered professional or personal decisions. The stories that surround these accounts are not uncommon. Neighbors who saw marriages rescued, parents who reconnected with estranged children, families who reorganized financial priorities to prioritize togetherness and prayer. This isn't a quick-fix propaganda campaign, but rather a demonstration of how consistent practice can make an impact. The sacredness of bonds isn't an abstract ideal. It's something that's built through concrete choices: accepting invitations to dialogue, setting aside time to be present, choosing to forgive rather than react. These are decisions that shape character and pave the way for a family culture of hope and responsibility. That's also necessary to address what the message warns about as a battlefield. Not everything that presents itself as urgent is actually a priority. There are distractions that disguise themselves as necessities: excessive consumption, unbridled routines, noisy opinions that invade the home, and fragment attention. The vigilance these messages demand, therefore, involves the ability to decide what enters and what leaves the family environment. Protecting the family includes filtering content, setting limits on screen use, creating spaces for uninterrupted conversation, and preserving rituals that nourish the spirit. These decisions, while practical, have a spiritual dimension. They defend inner peace and the ability to listen to what truly matters. When the family adopts this stance, something curious happens. The environment ceases to be merely a reflection of external crises and begins to be a source of resilience and light. The home becomes a laboratory of transformation, where mindsets change through practice, where decisions gain coherence, and where the hidden truth of warnings finds concrete expression. And it is precisely in this dynamic that the most useful revelations emerge, but the spectacular ones, but those that guide us to love better, to decide wisely, and to invest time in what generates lasting results. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and show how small practices of prayer, reconciliation, and presence can transform the home into a true refuge that protects and instructs. Comment below. This resonates with me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject and bring to light something that gives substance towards the social proof that turns theory into reality. The testimonies of those who have seen their lives change, These stories don't arrive as spectacular headlines. They arrive through back doors, behind the scenes, in hushed conversations between neighbors, in letters someone wrote after a long night of prayer. I'll tell 2 of them concisely and respectfully, without sensationalism, simply to show the human impact, the concrete transformation, and the decisions that began to shape destinies. The first is the story of Anna, a mother who, after years of hectic routines and strained relationships, describes feeling an inner calling that led her to rediscover the practice of presence. It wasn't an extraordinary event, it was an inner insistence that she slow down, talk to her husband without distractions, and rekindle the simple rituals of the home. Anna began with small steps: 5 minutes of silence upon waking, a brief prayer before meals, a weekly conversation without phones amped. Over the course of months, noticed a shift in the family's mindset. What had been tension became a space for dialogue. Small financial decisions were revised to prioritize coexistence, and the feeling of isolation was replaced by an intimacy that, according to her, saved the home. I'm not talking about an instantaneous healing, but a process of transformation that affected daily choices, reoriented values, and opened space for reconciliations that previously seemed impossible. This kind of story reveals something essential. Unspoken messages act as catalysts for change when they find concrete action. The second testimony comes from Joe, a man who was marked by impulses and quick decisions, always reacting before thinking, which had repercussions on his work and relationships. After participating in a pilgrimage and hearing stories about the urgency of prayer and fasting, Joe decided to try a simple discipline, a weekly period without social media, combined with a time of guided prayer upon awakening. He wasn't looking for miracles, he was seeking clarity to make better decisions. Within a few months, he noticed that his work decisions were more prudent, family conflicts lessened, and an old friendship was repaired. For Joe, the value wasn't in spectacular narratives, but in the practical impact: less reactivity, more responsibility and choices, and a growing sense of purpose. This testimony shows how revelations and practices can alter mindsets and produce lasting effects on a personal journey. These accounts fulfilled 2 important functions in the narrative. They give face to what could otherwise be mere doctrine, and they show that transformation involves daily decisions. They help us understand the hidden truth behind the message as something ethereal, but as a set of invitations that, when accepted, move internal and external structures. In both cases, the decisive element was the choice of discipline, a new habit, a change in priorities, a repeated decision that, over time, reshaped life. Transformation, therefore, is not an isolated event. It is a succession of small decisions that consolidate into character and social fruit. It's also worth emphasizing the care taken in interpreting these testimonies. Testimonies don't replace criteria for verification or discernment, they complement them. Authenticity is measured by its fruits: growing peace, reconciliation, responsibility, and consistency in actions. When a story generates pride, division, or extreme attitudes, it needs to be revisited with caution. The message, as perceived in the stories, values balance, a spiritual practice that generates humility, a fast that purifies intentions, a change of mindset that brings more love and less spectacle. Thus, the testimonies serve as indicators, not as absolute guarantees, but as signs that point to a possible path of transformation. Beyond individual stories, there's a growing community impact as a result of these accounts. People who experience change impact collective decisions. They form prayer groups, rebuild chains of care, and participate in local initiatives that prioritize the common good. This is where the warning ceases to be solitary and becomes social. The inner conversion of some translates into practices that benefit many. This is the kind of impact the message aims to produce: not paralyzing fear, but an impulse to act responsibly and lovingly, making decisions that change routines and, consequently, destinies. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and show how these testimonies guide us toward practical evaluation criteria. How to distinguish genuine change from a fleeting effect, what indicators to look for, and what concrete decisions to make to consolidate the transformation. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. And this is where the conversation requires care and balance. Because not every shining sign deserves to be followed without consideration. The messages that permeate stories, pilgrimages, and hearts carry a charge of mystery that fascinates. And this fascination can lead to both a sincere search for transformation and dangerous shortcuts. There is a hidden truth worth repeating. Not every miracle, not every emotional phenomenon or grandiose symbol is necessarily an authentic indicator of revelation. Discernment is not an intellectual luxury. It is a practice of spiritual survival that protects the mind, heart, and the decisions you make daily. When we talk about false signals, I'm not reducing everything to skepticism. On the contrary, the recommended stance is one of critical curiosity, looking, questioning, verifying. In many behind-the-scenes accounts, some phenomena proved genuine insofar as they bore fruit, lasting peace, reconciliation, humility, growing charity. In other cases, what initially attracted attention became a source of pride, division, or exploitation, and therein lies the first practical criterion for evaluation. Observe the fruits. An alleged revelation that generates hatred, confusion, or personal enrichment is suspect. One that promotes dialogue, healing, and accountability often points to something more authentic. Another pillar of discernment is prayer. When something extraordinary appears, the first wise response is to internalize and pray, to ask for light, calm, and clarity before acting. Prayer is not just a ritual. It is the lens that corrects vision, the discipline that prevents impulsive decisions, asking for guidance, silencing anxiety, and testing the experience in a spirit of humility reduces the likelihood of being carried away by hasty interpretations. The practice of fasting and recollection, which we explored earlier, also helps to calibrate the mind and avoid the traps of momentary emotion. Consulting trusted individuals is the third criterion that helps separate what is legitimate from what is deceptive. Spiritual leaders, experienced mentors, theologians, or even mature believers serve as filters that offer historical, theological, and psychological perspective. This isn't about delegating the responsibility of belief, but about submitting perceptions to common wisdom. Talking to those with experience is a wise practice that protects against decisions that may seem inspired in the heat of the moment, but lack practical and ethical support. There are also practical and objective signs worth observing: the coherence of the teaching with life-promoting values, the absence of requests for financial gain or emotional manipulation, the persistence of the beneficial effect over time. A warning or an apparition that mobilizes people to love more, care for others, and live with integrity tends to produce visible results. However, a supposed sign that culminates in attitudes of fear, segregation, or the pursuit of power needs to be viewed with caution. These are assessment tools as practical as theological discussion. They do not replace the mystery, but guide responsible decisions. It's also important to consider the social and psychological context. Crowds, social media, and media coverage amplify any story. Mass hysteria can transform small events into grand narratives that spiral out of control. Therefore, a mature approach involves time and patience, observing how things unfold, checking independent witnesses, assessing consequences, and avoiding cycles of panic or spectacle. In terms of mindset, this means cultivating a willingness to learn and resist impulses, prioritizing a journey of transformation built on consistent steps, not emotional peaks. Discernment also has an ethical component, protecting the vulnerable. When reports attract people weakened by pain, loss, or fear, there is a community responsibility to ensure that the search for signs does not become exploitation. Prudence involves offering welcome, guidance, and clear criteria, not denying space. For mystery, balanced practice involves welcoming the search, but not abandoning reason and compassion as guides. This is a type of impact that preserves human dignity and prevents hasty decisions from causing harm. At the same time, we must not confuse caution with coldness. Discernment does not mean dismissing revelations. It means honoring the seriousness of any experience that seeks to touch the sacred. The correct posture is that of someone who walks with open eyes and a willing heart, ready to adjust decisions, transform mindsets, and accept consequences. Thus, the hidden truth can emerge responsibly, producing revelations that guide concrete actions, reconciliation, ethical choices, habit changes, and dedication to the common good. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, and, with this criterion of discernment in mind, show practical examples of how to act when faced with a supposed sign, how to document it, who to consult, what questions to ask, and what fruits to look for over time. Tools that help transform curiosity into wise and impactful decisions. Comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and arrive at the message that seals the tone of hope and vigilance that permeates all the others. A promise that comes with a demand, the certainty that there is light ahead, as long as we are willing to maintain a posture of vigilance and coherence. This seventh warning is not a grim verdict. It is an invitation to a transformation that combines firmness and tenderness, a call to a mindset that neither despairs nor becomes complacent, but decides to act responsibly. In many accounts, the final promise appears as a pivot. If there is inner conversion, practices of prayer and fasting, family care, and discernment, then there will be protection, guidance, and a renewed purpose that will overcome difficulties. It is the combination of promise and practice, the kind of revelation that demands concrete decisions and generates real impact on the personal and community journey. To translate this into action, because hidden truths that don't translate into action tend to remain theories, it's helpful to consider simple, applicable steps. The first practical step, recommended by many stories, is to begin with a brief, intentional moment of prayer every day. 5 minutes of guided silence in the morning, where you breathe deeply, Offer your day and ask for clarity already shifts your mindset and guides decisions throughout the hours. It doesn't need to be elaborate. The goal is to create an inner axis that reorders priorities and generates small revelations about choices that previously seemed obvious. The second step points to the family as an instrument of protection, setting aside a weekly moment to gather those in the household, even if just 10 minutes to pray, listen to one another, and establish collective intentions, transforms the environment and strengthens bonds. These simple decisions have a cumulative effect that appears behind the scenes of coexistence, reducing impulsive reactions and promoting reconciliation. The third step is to nourish the mind with reliable accounts reading or studying a serious testimony, a well-documented narrative about the apparitions and their consequences. Because understanding the background and previous revelations helps to form judgment and prevent hasty decisions. Solid knowledge fosters discernment and conditions more responsible decisions. These three movements, short, regular prayer, intentional family gatherings, and careful study of reliable accounts function as a small transformation program you can begin today. They don't promise instant solutions, but they offer a path of consistency, repeated actions that reshape mindsets, embrace hidden truth, and produce tangible results. Proof of this comes from the stories we've heard. People who adopted seemingly simple routines and saw their priorities rearranged. Conflicts fade, and a sense of purpose emerge. The impact is less spectacular and more profound. Decisions that were previously reactive become thoughtful. Emotional consumption choices become more conscious, and the capacity to love with less calculation expands. This is, in a way, the essence of the final promise on articulated hope that goes hand in hand with responsibility and small behavioral revolutions. When contemplating this promise, it's important to maintain a balanced posture of vigilance. Vigilance isn't panic, it's deliberate attention to one's own choices and one's environment. It's deciding to limit what enters the home, choosing to pacify tense conversations, cultivating silence that allows one to hear signals, and seeking wise companionship when decisions prove difficult. These attitudes are the cement that transforms a plea into a path. Without them, the best of promises remains abstract. With them, hope begins to be visibly realized. The mindset this requires combines humility and courage. The humility to acknowledge mistakes and ask for help. The courage to renounce habits that corrode relationships and curb impulses that fragment attention. The impact of this attitude reverberates throughout the family, the community, and the public decisions that each person influences. Even if subtly, there is also a social dimension to this call. When individuals adopt this discipline, circles of practice are formed that sustain larger changes. Small prayer communities, groups reading trustworthy stories, families that establish moments of reconciliation, all of these form a network that multiplies individual fruits into collective impact. This is where the promise is reaffirmed. In practice, what begins as an inner decision ends up shaping social habits and influencing cultural priorities. The hidden truth, therefore, does not remain merely an enigma. It manifests itself in behaviors and decisions that generate well-being, solidarity, and resistance to the temptations of spectacle and fear. At the same time, this practical conclusion calls for patience. Transformation is a process and requires repetition. There may be setbacks, days of apathy, and moments when old mindsets try to return. It's not about perfection, but about persistence, small choices, constant resumptions, and adjustments. The final promise, read this way, is less a magical guarantee and more an invitation to a worthwhile journey, a journey where every decision matters and where vigilance transforms into active presence. These are the elements that unite the 7 messages into a coherent framework: conversion, prayer, signs, family, testimonies, discernment, and, finally, a hope that demands responsibility. These are the silent screams, and your response can change everything. If this part touched you, write in the comments, "This message was for me." If you've made it this far, thank you for walking with me through this conversation. If you felt this brought clarity or touched something within you, hit the like button. This simple gesture helps me know this content makes sense and is worth continuing to produce. If you'd like to follow the upcoming reflections and practical tools on prophecy, prayer, and transformation, subscribe to the channel. The goal here is to walk together, responsibly and deeply, without easy promises, just steps that truly help. Leave a comment that shows you've made it to the end right. I'm with you until the end. Or this message was for me. I'll read each one, and this strengthens our community of seekers. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click it and stay with me there to continue deepening these practices in our daily lives. Thank you for being here. Let's stay attentive and with an open heart.